Thank you, Benoit, for inviting me. Not only for inviting me, we were supposed to get some work done together, but yes, thank you, and thank you to the organizers as well. This is joint work with Jen Baggs in the business school at UVic. I sort of came into this project, two colleagues in the business school asked me to join in and do some discussion on immigration. And as you see now, I'm sort of the lead author, so I've squeezed every bit of business school out of the paper and made it an economics paper. So that's where we are with this. Okay, so a little bit of introduction. I think this is something that everybody in this room is aware of. What we do know is that the earnings outcomes of recent immigrants to Canada are below those of similarly skilled native-born workers. Okay? The gaps are larger for men and rarely fully sort of dissipate over time. So we've got these gaps at entry relative to skill level that don't disappear over time in Canada. Okay? A lot of work's been done to try and explain these gaps and the disappearing gaps. And most of the work that's been done is looking at differences in human capital and the returns to human capital. Okay? Where's Mikhail? Mikhail's done a lot of work in this area. And so some of the gap has been explained by these human capital, but not all of the gap. So we know that there's lower returns to foreign labor market experience, there's lower returns to foreign education. That helps to explain some of the gap, as well as language and region of origin that tends to explain some of the gap and what's going on with immigrant wage and earnings outcomes in Canada. Okay? All right, so at the same time, recent research has examined the importance of unobserved firm factors in explaining these wage outcomes and the gaps. Okay? And these studies show that it's really the sorting of immigrants, recent immigrants, into low-wage firms that's important. Right? So what's happening essentially is that immigrants are arriving in Canada and they're being sorted in some way into firms that just sort of pay on average lower wages, so lower wage firms, right? And what's not going on is that the outcomes aren't explained by differences in pay within firms. So it's not that immigrants in the same firm are being paid lower wages than others. So this is interesting, right? So these unobserved firm factors. What our study does is to examine the relationship between observable firm level characteristics. So we want to sort of take that black box, what do we mean by these unobserved effects, and sort of bring it in and try to describe what it is about these firms that leads them to pay lower wages. Okay, and so we look at observable characteristics and immigrant wage outcomes. So we're going to identify the explicit firm attributes associated with wage premiums and the nature of immigrant sorting. So our focus is, given previous research, is on that sorting mechanism, right? How are immigrants sorted across firms? And so we'd like to know, in some ways, a cross-section is a way to kind of deal with this. We're kind of interested in that cross-sorted or cross-sectional sorting of immigrants across firms. Okay, and that'll come through with the presentation. You'll see that that's sort of what we're going to focus on. Okay, so a little bit of background, a little bit more information. Right, so as I said, an emerging body of research examined the role of firms in explaining wage variation across workers. So there's a lot of work that's been done recently looking at those unobserved firm factors. Okay, and after all, the idea here is just that the firm at which an individual is employed it turns out to be an important determinant of wages across workers with similar observable skills, right? So you get these differences. So in other words, the law of one price doesn't hold in the market. We've known that for some time, okay? And there's a number of possible explanations for what's going on here. We can think about discrimination, obviously something that's relevant to perhaps to the immigrant labor market, compensating differentials, which we all know and are familiar with. Search and matching models might give you differences in wage outcomes across firms. Maybe some firms have monopsony power and they're just able to pay higher wages, and so there's some way that workers are able to gain some of that monopsony wages. And then equilibrium strategic wage posting. So there's also this idea that maybe firms offer sort of a menu of characteristics that individuals might be interested in, different fringe benefits and so on, and they're able to pay then workers different depending on your choices. Okay. All right. So employer attributes may play an important role in the wage outcome of immigrants. We argue that there's no doubt, and I think the literature shows that those employer attributes are going to play an important role in the wage outcomes of immigrants, especially new immigrants, right? So we think about new immigrants, think about search, matching, discrimination, pay policies. They're all going to be affected by the fact that new immigrants, first of all, are less efficient at job search. They've just arrived, hard to search. Lack of local employment history. So we're thinking about individuals trying to signal their unobserved skill. It's going to be more difficult if you're an immigrant that just arrived. They have a different set of observed or unobserved Canada-specific skills that may be valuable in a country, might be valuable in some firms and not valuable in others. We're thinking here sort of, export firms might be interested in some of the unobserved skills that immigrants might have that allow them to expand exports across the country or across the world, for example. Okay. They have a unique country of origin skills as well that might be valued differently across firms. And finally, they may value those workplace amenities differently, right? They might value having pension, dental, and those things differently than the native-born workers. Okay. So certainly recent arrivals, we think that firm is going to play a big role in which firm they're matched to. It might play a role in the wages that we observe. But then over time, of course, a lot of these characteristics change. So things like efficiency of job search, employment history, all of those things change with time and country. And so we might expect to see some of those firm effects change as immigrants spend more time in Canada. Okay. So most of the studies examining firm-level wage effects, as I said, identify unobserved firm or established characteristics. And that's captured by that time-invariant firm fixed effects. So this may be familiar to many of you, the sort of AKM model, which is a two-way fixed effect model. Right? So we just captured those unobserved factors from in that model. Okay. This sort of AKM model has been used, or these firm-level wage effects are the basis of a number of examinations of earnings differentials. So they've been used to try and explain earnings differentials across groups. Okay, so they've been used to look at gender differences, and so we look at matching and maybe differences in pay within firms across gender to try and explain gender wage gaps and race. Okay, so we've looked at race as well. And there's a couple of citations there for those. Okay. Now, a similar approach has been used to examine the role of firm-level wage premiums, as I mentioned earlier, in immigrant native wage gaps. Okay, so Macal's done some work, and most recently we have the card paper as well, looking at the role of these firm-level fixed effects. Okay, and what those studies find, if I can generalize, is that they find that the sorting of immigrants into low-wage establishments explains a significant portion of their earnings gap. Okay, so there's a significant portion of the gap is explained by the sorting of immigrants into those low-wage firms. Okay, and this is especially true for low-educated immigrants. Okay, and immigrants from non-traditional source countries. So most of the action there seems to be concentrated among low-educated and those from certainly non-traditional source countries. If we think back many years, is explaining. So we see a lot of action there. And second, they find that many immigrants that are at least initially matched to low-wage firms move to higher wage firms, right? So you initially match to a low wage firm, and then you eventually move on to a higher wage firm. Okay, and that helps to explain why immigrant wages catch up to native-born wages. Okay, now that catching up is highest among the highest educated workers from non-traditional source countries. So these big gaps at entry for highly educated workers from non-traditional source countries, and then you see sort of a lot of catching up with time and country. So you see better matching over time among that group of workers. Okay. Now, a small number of studies examine at the same time the role of observed firm characteristics. So trying to look at what's the role of observed firm characteristics in wage outcomes of workers. Okay? I know that McHale in his study does a little bit of that, more on sort of job characteristics, similar to what Anna was talking about earlier. But one paper that I cite here, Barth Davis Freeman, I'll call it the Freeman paper from now on, does, I think, a really good job of this using US data. Okay? In that paper from 2018, and I'm surprised this paper doesn't get more attention, actually, because it's really interesting. What they do is essentially estimate an augmented standard earnings equation, augmented in the sense that what they do is they just include in the regression a bunch of firm characteristics or establishment characteristics. Okay? And they do it for US manufacturing because that's the sector that they have a lot of information on. Okay? So US manufacturing. And what they find is that, not surprisingly, if you're a labor economist, the size of the establishment matters. Okay? So level of employment at the firm matters, and you get higher pay associated with bigger firms. Firm level research and development, so the measure of how much firms are investing in research and development, those firms tend to pay higher wages. Okay? Capital equipment per worker, maybe not surprising, but you get this nice matching between capital equipment and wage outcomes or earnings outcomes. And surprising to me, at least, was this strong correlation between the education level of the workforce, okay, and at the firm, and the individual's wage outcome. Okay? In fact, that was the strongest outcome that they found. So in their cross-section results, essentially what they find is that the returns to one more year average education of the workforce in which you're joining has the same effect as one more year of your own education. Okay? So huge effects from average education at the firm. Okay? That's a cross-section, so some of what's going on there obviously is that you have this assortative matching, you have more able workers ending up at those firms, and so they would have earned higher wages anyway. So some of it goes away when you control for individual fixed effects, but nonetheless, this is a really strong finding, right? So this education. Okay, okay, so that's the other literature that we're going to lean on. I would argue that very little is known, nothing is known about the role of observed firm level characteristics in immigrant wage outcomes. So we don't know very much about what of these characteristics influence immigrants. Maybe are they different for immigrants than non-immigrants? So nothing's been done to sort of look at immigrant outcomes. And that's kind of where we come in. We're going to take essentially that Dosti paper and mash it together with this Freeman paper, okay, and look at observed firm attributes. Okay, so here's what we do. We're going to use the Workplace and Employment Survey, WES, okay, and we're only going to use 1 year. And what I'm showing you here, we've done it for other years. We've used some of the panel aspect. I'll talk about why we don't use panel aspect in a moment, but we use kind of the most latest year that we have, 2005. Okay, the nice thing about WES is, first of all, it's nationally representative. Okay, it's linked employer-employee data, so you have information on the employer as well as the employee. Okay, and nicely, it includes a really rich set of establishment level attributes. Okay, so even compared to, you might say, well, we could use SEED, it's more recent, right? But SEED, I mean, you get some information from taxes that might give you some information about firms, but not perfect, right? And so, so the nice thing about WES is this, and some people argue that it's a little bit dated now, but a lot of the presentations today were a bit, using data from this time period. So I don't think we're too far off. Okay, WES is also longitudinal for firms, so it follows firms in every year. Okay, and for concurrent years for employees, right? So I can observe individuals 2 years, but then I don't observe them anymore. But firms over the entire time period. Okay. We're going to look. Anna's not going to be happy with me. We're going to look only at men because in our results we didn't observe very big wage gaps. So we're going to try to explain those wage gaps. We didn't observe them for women in our sample, but maybe some of the good firm, bad firm stuff, descriptive, might be interesting for women as well. Okay. Following the literature, we're going to classify immigrants into basically 4 broad groups. So we think about our immigrants based on, first of all, years since arrival. So we're going to look at recent, so less than 10 years, and established, more than 10 years. Okay? We're going to also separate out immigrant groups by their country of origin. So we're going to look at traditional US, Europe, and then non-traditional, so Asia, and so on. Okay? And we're going to compare outcomes across, as well, at the same time, across broad education categories. So Benoit's paper shows quite clear that education, and these broad education matters, the outcomes are very different depending on the level of education that we're looking at. Okay? So we're going to essentially rerun things looking at broadly based groups, college degree and higher versus no degree at all. So we're just going to separate out those two groups as well. Okay. Okay, what we do in a nutshell. Well, we're going to identify, first of all, on which observed establishment attributes immigrant groups are sorted. So essentially a bit of a descriptive, where are these, what types of firms are immigrants in each of these groups located, what types of firms are they sorted or matched with, and compare that to native born. Okay. Then we're going to establish the relationship between those observable establishment level characteristics and wage outcomes, estimate some wage equations. What are the returns to these establishment level characteristics? Okay? By estimating, again, much like Freeman, that augmented earnings equation. We're going to look for differences across immigrants and native born. And why we do that is because we think that the returns to these characteristics might give us some clues as to which of those models, which of these reasons for differences in wages across firms is explaining what's going on for immigrants, right? So if we see that it's a menu of items that the firm offers, then maybe we expect to see differences in pension and dental and that sort of thing. Okay? If it's just productivity differences and monopsony power, then maybe that's going to show up in terms of productivity. Okay? And then finally, our last step is to do essentially a Oaxaca decomposition. We're going to try to identify how much of the earnings gaps are explained by this differential sorting across firms. Okay, so again, we leave off a lot of the when we do the decomposition, we're going to leave off a lot of the sort of unexplained stuff, the differences in pay within firms, right, or across firms with same characteristics, because again, we're sort of focused on this matching issue. Okay. All right, so what do we do? Okay, well, what does the data look like? Well, on the left-hand side, we've got hourly wages. Okay, so we're going to use wage data. Okay, and this is produced in the West. It includes everything: overtime, bonus pay. So it's a way of sort of taking all of that and boiling it down into an hourly wage. Okay. We debated over that, weekly earnings. In the end, we ran with hourly wages, but we can redo this for things like weekly wages. Okay. We're also going to include the usual demographics that we're used to seeing in an earnings equation: age, education, years experience, seniority, region, language, marital status, and then we're going to add our firm characteristics. Okay, so these are our firm characteristics. Okay, and some of these are often included in earnings equations, but technically speaking, they're associated with a firm. Okay, so union status, industry. I throw in occupation here, although that's maybe more of a job characteristic than a firm characteristic. We have foreign ownership, the percent of the firm that's foreign owned. We have whether or not you're an exporter, and that just means that 20% of your sales go to export market. Okay? Revenue per worker, that's our attempt to try and get at productivity. We don't have any capital measures in here, so we're just using revenue per worker as a way of trying to see how productive these firms are. And then R&D intensity, and this is just a response to a question about how important is R&D in your business plan. And so here we're just looking at those where that's very important. I've divided up thinking about employees. So we've got number of employees, the share of employees that are full-time, the quit rate at the firm, how many people in a year relative to the size of the firm quit, the share of new hires, and then we're trying to get at this education thing that we saw in the Freeman paper. And we don't have average education of workers at the firm. Okay? And so what we use is the share of workers that are earning more than $80,000. Okay, and that cuts off about the top 10% of workers essentially in our survey. Okay, it's not perfect as a proxy for the level of the skill level, we'll call it, but I'm going to return to this again because we do a little bit more once we discover that actually this is the big driver in the paper. Right, turns out that skill level or our proxy is driving a lot of the results. Okay. All right, and then on the HR side of things, we have whether or not the firm staffs outside of the firm, so whether they hire outside of the firm or whether they hire inside. We've got a bunch of information on training, and we have whether there's a pension or dental plan at the firm. Okay, so there's a lot of information here. I'm going to try and go through this, and I'm going to try and focus especially on these firm characteristics, but I'll briefly go through some of the other results as well. Okay, I don't expect you to be able to read this. This is just for me to remind myself that what I need to talk about this. Okay, so these are descriptive stats, right? And these are the sort of typical characteristics that you would see in a wage equation, right? And we see the same things that we've all seen a million times looking at male immigrant outcomes. Male immigrants tend to be more highly educated. They have fewer years of seniority, especially their recent arrivals. So I've got recent immigrants and established immigrants here. Around the same years of experience if you control for time in the country, so still have experience. And this isn't dividing out education that's been received in Canada and outside. So we have to be a little bit careful about that. And we also see fewer years of seniority. Okay, so all the things that you've seen before in these. Here's the interesting stuff, I think. This is characteristics across those firm characteristics divided up in the same way that I had on that initial slide. Okay, so what do we see? Well, if anything, right, immigrants, especially established immigrants, tend to be work in firms where there's high rate of foreign ownership. Okay, so if you look at the traditional and non-traditional established immigrants. If anything, we look at recent immigrants, lower revenue per worker, so they tend to be matched to firms with maybe lower productivity or a proxy for productivity. Interestingly enough, if we look at firm size, about the same, right? So for all of the groups, relatively the same. Same thing with share of full-time, pretty much the same. When we look at now negative attributes, I think, like quit rate and the share of new hires, right? What we see here is that among recent immigrants, the non-traditional, right? We see that that group of immigrants is more likely to be linked to firms with these characteristics. Okay, hire, quitter. New hires, you got to get hired, right? Exactly, right? But the difference between traditional and non-traditional recent, right, is a bit telling here, right? That we don't see that there. Okay, and then the variable that we're going to say is important here, the share greater than 80K. That's our skill level. We don't see much for established immigrants. Recent traditional, not much different than non-immigrants, but non-traditional recent immigrants, significantly lower skill level at the firm. Doesn't look like a lot yet, right? So that's what I did too. Wait till we get to the education. We break it up by education. You'll see really big differences. Once we condition even just a little bit on education on broad groups, then you're going to see some pretty big differences. Okay, what else? Well, pension, dental, they look the same, right? So I'm looking for, hey, immigrants are working in these really bad firms. What's going on here? It doesn't look like, they're getting, really bad jobs without pension and dental plans and things like that. If anything here as well, maybe recent immigrants, and I know Benoit has a paper on looking at training, are less likely to work in a firm that provides training. Okay, so we see that in the data as well. Okay, here, just look at the very bottom line. Okay, so this is now, we're breaking things out, non-immigrants, recent immigrants, and established immigrants by those broad education categories. Okay, and here I think is where you see now this difference in the share 80K, that our skill measure. So when we look at, for example, recent immigrants with a degree, okay, the share with 80K or more is about 10% compared to non-immigrants of 17. So pretty big differential there, okay? Same thing for recent immigrants with no degree, comparing them to non-immigrants with no degree. We see some pretty big differences. And then we don't see that among established immigrants. So established immigrants seem to be matched when we parcel out by broad education categories, seem to be matched to firms with similar skill level to native-born workers, okay? Okay, this we don't need, okay. All right, so that is sort of describing what's going on with matching with immigrant groups across firms. Now we want to know something about the returns to those skills. Okay? So we estimate this augmented earnings equation. Okay? And essentially what we do is we're going to allow the x variables, which are the column vector, which is our column vector of worker characteristics, the usual productivity and individual characteristics. We've also had now add in this vector of z's, right? And these are those firm characteristics, right? And so we're going to estimate the returns to those firm characteristics, holding fixed all of the productivity characteristics. Okay? And we've got an immigrant dummy here because essentially what we're doing is we're going to estimate this fully interacted with immigrant variables. So we're going to allow the coefficients on individual characteristics and firm characteristics to vary across immigrants and non-immigrants. Okay? One thing to note here, and I think this was pointed out in the Freeman paper, is that the addition of these firm characteristics may in fact have an impact on the returns to those demographic and productivity characteristics. And that'll be the case, of course, if firm attributes affect wages, first of all, so they have an impact, and that workers are sorted in a non-random manner across those firms, right? So that some of the returns to education might be explained by the fact that workers with higher levels of education are sorted into firms with higher levels of higher pay, right? Firms that pay higher wages. Okay, so and in fact we end up finding that that's the case. Okay, all right. So my note on fixed effects. We don't include individual or establishment fixed effects. Okay, obviously we're just using 1 year of data. I did have other years of data, so we could have used panel data to do this. First of all, as McCall pointed out in his paper, the sample design doesn't permit worker fixed effects. And the problem is, of course, non-random attrition, right? So you get from 1 year to the next, all you observe is the group of workers that stay, and we don't know much about the workers that left. And so we get that non-random attrition. Now, firm effects we could add, and in fact, in thinking about this, it seems like the least interesting case. I would love to be able to, I think I might go back and add in, despite the difficulty, individual fixed effects. Why not firm fixed effects? Well, first of all, it's going to limit the analysis, right? So we're interested in those firm characteristics, okay? And so I can't include anything that doesn't vary over time. Firm characteristics that don't vary, they're out, okay? And second, if I do include a firm fixed effect, then what I'm picking up really is just short-term changes in those variables, right? So short-term changes in, for example, the skill level at the firm, and Freeman does this, and not surprisingly, you find smaller effects as a result. And so for our purposes, because what we're interested in is matching, are we really interested in getting a clear estimate of the return to these characteristics? Maybe, but for us, we're kind of more interested in matching, and so we're gonna, for that reason, we're gonna keep those in there. Okay, again, you're not gonna be able to read this, and that's okay. This is just another cue for me. First of all, I'll point out that when we add our firm effects, observed firm effects, we explain a lot more of the variation in wages, not surprising, okay? And so in each of these is about the same. We're explaining another 24% of the variation in wages when we add those firm effects. So they're explaining quite a bit, all right? We fixed this a little bit, right? We've added industry as one of our firm characteristics. We normally include that in a wage equation, but nonetheless, it is something that's associated with firms, okay? The other thing that you won't see, but I'll tell you, is that all of the individual effects are attenuated when we add in these firm fixed effects. So that what we end up seeing is that the returns to education are smaller when we add firm fixed effects. So there is some sort of matching on education, for example, across higher paying firms. More highly educated workers are matched to higher firms. Same thing with experience, seniority, and those sorts of things. Okay, here are our regressions, and now these are the returns to these characteristics. And remember, we're allowing those returns to vary by non-immigrant and each of our immigrant groups. So this first one is, right, our traditional, non-traditional, recent, and established immigrants. Okay, I'm going to try and summarize this because I don't want to take too much time in going through too many of the details. Those are in the paper. What I would say is just that when we think about characteristics that pay positive, that firm characteristics that are associated with higher pay, those are things like R&D intensity, revenue per worker productivity, as we'd expect, shows up positive. Employment size, we know that from the literature. The share of full-time, right? And then the share greater than 80K is massive, right? So you get these really big returns to, much like the Freeman paper, if you work in a firm that is highly skilled, okay? And we see that across the board. At the same time, there's some interesting differences between non-immigrant and immigrant groups, okay? In particular, export and foreign ownership seems to pay higher for it, especially when we break up by education, seem to have a bit higher returns for immigrants than non-immigrants. The quit rate has a lower impact on our recent non-traditional immigrants, right? Again, we might expect that given these are new entrants to the labor market, but again, we don't see that in some of the other groups, okay? Share of new hires, again, some differences there, okay? Returns to pension dental are about the same. Classroom training and job training in general, what we've found is that training, and when immigrants are matched to firms that offer training, the payoff is much higher. Okay? So that in some ways training pays off more if you're an immigrant than you're not, okay? And again, this is not that they've necessarily taken the training, right? But this is the case in which the firm offers the training. And so we see some positive wage outcomes as a result. Okay, all right. This is now the results by degree status. So again, we're kind of breaking, we want to make sure that we're covering, the degree outcomes. And I've stripped it down because most of what we saw in the previous table also holds when we look across degree status. The one I've parceled out again is just that share of 80K. And what we see here again, across all of these groups are pretty big returns to working in a firm that has a higher skill level as captured by our proxy here, okay? So if we think about non-immigrants with no degree, for example, that says essentially that a 10% increase 10 percentage point increase in the share of 80K is going to raise wages by 9%. Big, right? Okay. So, all right. So now we know what the returns to these characteristics are. The last step is to do a decomposition. And what we're going to do is decompose those overall raw differences in average earnings across immigrants and native-born, okay, using the simple Oaxaca decomposition, and we're using the Newmark extension, which just essentially means that we're going to use, despite the fact that we observe differences in returns to some of those firm characteristics, we're going to pool the two groups together and use the returns from that pooled regression. Okay? It turns out that despite some of the differences, the main results don't change much, whether we use the returns from the immigrant regression or native-born regression, we get the same results anyway. Okay, and so basically with the decomposition, we're looking at differences in log wages across the two groups, and we're decomposing them into that part which is due to differences in the characteristics, right? And that part which is due to differences in the rate of pay to those different characteristics. Okay? And the one that we're mostly interested in here is our Z here, right? This just says, right, how much, so the fourth term here is going to capture how much of the overall wage difference is due to differential sorting across those observed firm characteristics for immigrants and native-born workers. Okay? We're less interested in the fifth, which just says, how much of it is due to these differences in rates of pay to those characteristics. And as I say, that's because we're mostly interested in the matching outcomes. Okay? So we're going to look at that differential sorting and how much that differential sorting and which of those characteristics, those firm characteristics, explains the difference in wages across immigrant and non-immigrant groups. Okay. Okay. So this table, I need to say a little bit of something about it. Now, what I've done is I'm just looking at all of our groups of recent arrivals. Okay, so all of our groups of recent arrivals are on here. And of course, I'm only going to be looking at the firm characteristics. Not so much, a lot of work has been done with individual characteristics, so we're just looking at firm characteristics. Okay, so for recent arrivals, those from traditional source countries, the wage differential is negative, which just says that actually, in our sample, the wages of immigrants that arrive from traditional source countries are slightly higher, right, than native-born. Okay, everybody else has lower wages. Every other group in our sample. Okay, all right. We've added an extra column here, non-traditional degree, and that's because we were seeing a lot of action with immigrants, recent arrivals from non-traditional countries, and recent arrivals with degrees in particular, right? So we saw these really big wage gaps. So these are pretty big wage gaps. Okay, and then when we start looking at all of the characters, you'll notice that almost nothing is statistically significant, except for share greater than 80K. Okay, and what I take away from this is to say that what it looks like is that it's not that immigrants are, and we saw this in the descriptive statistics as well, it's not that immigrants are ending up, at least initially, in firms that have a cluster of characteristics that are associated with low pay, right? It's not like they're ending up, I'm going to go forward here as well. You see, these are the other characteristics that didn't fit on that first slide. Pension, dental, immigrants, all of our recent immigrants have around the same access to pension and dental plans. So these aren't bad jobs across the board from that perspective, right? The only thing that we see, employment, the size of the firm, it's not like they're being matched to small firms, and right, it's so it's not like these jobs that pay low have a bunch of characteristics that are associated with low pay. Okay? The only thing that stands out again is this share, our skill measure, at the firm that share greater than 80K. Okay? When I saw this, when I looked at the results, I was a little disappointed because, gee, why a proxy, right? Why not something that's solid and concrete and I can point to and say it's clearly this, right? But the data does what the data does, and so that's what we ended up with. Okay. Okay, so when we look at, now this is our established group, right? Nothing, right? There's not much to explain, first of all. The wage differentials for established immigrants compared to native-born are not big, and if anything, we see degree holders, we see differences with established immigrants with a degree compared to non-immigrants with a degree. But there's really not much to explain, and so again, that matching with firms with lower skill level, we don't see them. 1 or 2 minutes. Okay, thank you. Have I missed the other flashes? Okay, I'll be quick. Okay, so we don't see it among established immigrants. Okay, so last thing I need to do then. All right, if this really is skill, or there's something wrong with our skill proxy, right? So, and the problem with the skill proxy is it's kind of the best that we can do, but, right, if we think about a simple earnings distribution, right, a higher percent of workers that are paid above some threshold, okay, is also consistent, right? It's first of all consistent with a firm that pays, right, that has a more highly skilled workforce, okay? So something like that maybe, okay? But it's also consistent with a firm that just pays higher wages at every skill level, right? So it's also consistent with just shifting this whole thing this way, right? So now you have a higher percentage. Okay, so we're going to worry about that. Okay, and so what we do is we also have average per worker payroll. Okay, so we know what the average payroll, average pay is at the firm. Okay, and what we're going to do is we're going to partial out the effect of that average pay. Okay, so we're essentially going to redo the analysis. We'll include this average pay. We were worried about including it initially because, well, of course, average pay is going to impact your wage at that firm. Okay? But here we're going to partial it out. Okay? And I'm going to argue that these results likely understate the true effect of average skill level. Why is that? Well, we're removing this one. That's great, right? By partialing out average skill. But we're also removing, right, this out, right? Because firms that pay that have a more highly skilled workforce, right? Even if they pay the same for each level of skill, those that have a higher skill level are going to have a higher average payroll. Okay, and we're partialing that part of it out as well. So we're doing too much essentially. We're taking too much out of the results. Okay, so we're going to interpret these new results as a kind of lower bound. Okay, this is new, so if you have some comments on it, I'd be happy to hear. Okay, here's what it looks like. Okay, so average payroll, right? So this is the Oaxaca decomposition. This is telling me, how much differences in the distribution across average payroll firms, across skilled versus unskilled firms is explaining. And again, this is for all of my recent arrivals. Okay, so what we see is, of course, traditional nothing going on. Okay, now the rest of them, I was surprised. So even after taking out average payroll explains some of the gap. Okay, for these groups. Okay. In fact, I've got percentage-wise. So for non-traditional, the average differences in average payroll, in which you're matched, explains about 8.9% of the differential for non-traditional. Yet we still see results for the share greater than 80K, our skill measure. Okay. And now they're a bit smaller, okay, but they stick around. And again, we are sort of interpreting these as our lower bound. Okay. All right. Am I out of time? Okay, I'm out of time. Okay, so this is just summarizing all of the results that we had. There's some discussion. One point that I was going to make is that we don't have capital, and that might be an issue because to the extent that capital and skilled labor are complements in production, then maybe the skill is picking up too much, right? The good news is just before I left for this conference, they're giving me the West data that is matched to Giphy, and I'm going to be able to control for capital. Okay. Thank you.
Very good. Okay, great. So I'm happy to be here. So I'm Jean-Félix Bouillette from HEC, and happy to discuss firm characteristics and immigrant wage outcomes in Canada by Herbert and Jen. Okay, so I'm a macroeconomist, so a little bit of macro context for this paper. We've all gathered here mainly because of this fact, okay? So immigration is composing an increasing share of the Canadian labor force. But at the same time, what we know is that Canadian labor productivity is stalling, okay, compared to our southern neighbor. And so this kind of begs the question of whether we're taking full advantage of the talent that is supplied by immigrants in Canada. And that's an important question because what we know from the US is that immigrants contribute quite a lot to aggregate productivity growth, okay? So there's compelling studies that show that immigrants are more likely to be inventors and entrepreneurs compared to US natives. And those occupations contribute disproportionately to productivity growth, okay? And so it could very well be the case that immigrant talent in Canada is misallocated within the economy, okay? And that could have important aggregate consequences. In fact, there's also some other papers that try to quantify the drag on productivity growth that immigrant talent misallocation can have, and they show that it's quite important. Okay? And so what we need to dig deeper into this macro question is more micro evidence to identify the sources of such immigrant talent misallocation, and this is what this paper provides. Okay? Now, more specifically, this paper, as you've heard, is part of a literature that tries to explain the determinants of the wage gap between native and immigrants, and especially the role of firms, okay? And it builds on a paper by Dosti, Lee, and Parent, who find that roughly 1/3 of the wage gap between natives and immigrants is coming from the sorting of immigrants into low-paying firms. Now, what this paper does is to try to crack open the black box of this firm fixed effect, okay? Because the Dosti, Lee, and Parent basically find a very big role for the sorting component of the fixed effect. So which firm characteristics matter more for this sorting behavior? And the key finding here is that immigrants disproportionately sort into what they call low-skill firms, okay? And that's even more true for recent immigrants and also for immigrants from non-traditional countries. But the good news is that over time, these immigrants move towards higher skill firms, okay? But the paper leaves us with a puzzle, which is basically what prevents immigrants from sorting into those high skill firms upon arrival. So that's kind of like on all of us to study next, and this is kind of the question that this paper opens up to. Now I see several, several strengths with this paper, and I think the main contribution is to use data with very rich establishment characteristics, again, to do this deep dive into the black box of the firm fixed effect. And this sheds light on the importance of the skill composition of your colleagues for explaining this wage gap between natives and immigrants. And so they use, as I said, a proxy to try to capture this skill composition as the share of colleagues earning more than $80,000 per year. And that's robust to controlling for average wages, the average wages of your colleagues. Okay. And so this paper provokes two questions. What is so special about these high-skill firms? Is it positive assortative matching? Is it a learning theory? And so that helps us kind of like push our theories of the labor market forward in terms of explaining the wage gap between immigrants and natives. And also, why can't immigrants find jobs at these firms when they arrive in Canada? Okay, maybe that's efficient, maybe that's not. And so that's a question that still is left to be answered. But it's part of the contribution of this paper to shed light on this important channel. Now, in terms of limitations, there are some limitations with the paper. They are mostly acknowledged by the authors. Okay, the first one is that the analysis doesn't control for unobserved worker heterogeneity because that's just not feasible in this data. Okay, and there are reasons why that might be important. So, for example, before 2005, which is the time of the analysis, most immigrants in Canada, well, a lot of immigrants in Canada were on closed work permits, and so their ability to sort into different firms was limited, and that might have had some impact on the wage outcomes that they could have achieved. Okay, and so it's something that ideally you would like to control for because that could bias the coefficients that they find in the analysis, and it's a characteristic that is fixed at the worker level as well. And you have the same issue with credentials because it could be that some immigrants with certain occupation credentials might differentially sort into firms with more high-paying colleagues. You could think of doctors or engineers, for example, and that might have had some implications for their wage outcomes as well. However, this is not doable in the data. Okay, so the analysis is still very important and sheds light on an important mechanism, but we might have to interpret the results with just a little bit of caution. Okay, but that's the best that you can do with this data. The other issue that was mentioned by Herbert is that the measurement of skill here is through a proxy, okay? However, they do control for the average wage, okay? Which means that the share of your colleagues that earn 80K per year could also be a proxy for the wage dispersion within the establishment, right? Controlling for the average wage, if you have more colleagues that earn a lot of money, you also have more colleagues that earn less, okay? And so you could think of a theory, for example, where if immigrants are, there's a lottery of where you might end up within the establishment in terms of salary, and you're a little bit more risk averse because you arrive to a place that you don't really know. You might refrain from joining these establishments just because you're afraid to end up at the at the lower scale of this wage structure. Okay, and so yeah, just to say that this proxy might capture different things than just skill level. It might also capture wage dispersion within the establishment. Another limitation that's just, again, from the data is that the data is in 2005, so it goes from 1999 to 2005 in total. And we might have some doubts in terms of how it generalizes to the current situation of immigrants in Canada, because the economic reality of immigrants has changed quite a bit since 2005. So for example, after 2005, we've seen a much higher prevalence of open work permits, and so a much greater flexibility of immigrants to sort into different occupations that with more freedom, basically. Okay, so now I've learned that this is not feasible with this data, so I would have proposed to try to control more directly for measures of skills. So for example, the average level of education at the firm, or exploit some of the time variation in this. But I think more importantly, perhaps something, I don't know if that's doable with the data, but to try to explicitly control for wage dispersion might tease out a little bit more the specific contribution of having high-paying colleagues, or colleagues that receive a high wage, to try to shed more light into this theory of perhaps it's positive assortative matching or learning within the firm. Okay, so maybe that's something that is doable with the data that could be interesting, and would control for the confounding effect of just wage dispersion rather than the skill level within the firm. Okay, so that's all I have. Thank you, everyone, and this was really a pleasure to read this wonderful paper.